So what I want to talk about is a paradigm shift that's been occurring in my life over the last number of years. And it's involved the transformation of my life from one characterized by habitual consumption to one that's much more focused on creative production, collaboration, connection, and empathy. So I'm right in the middle of this process. So I don't exactly know where this story ends, and I'm not even sure exactly how it begins. But in many ways, I'm just a really normal person. I went to university, I got a job, I worked hard to earn money, I accrued debt. I tried for a comfortable, happy life. Somewhere along the way, I realized that I felt like something was wrong. And if you've ever watched the news or surfed the web, you might agree that something actually is wrong. Our world is full of violence and injustice and environmental degradation. And the problems are so big, and our world has been made so small by the internet and the media that there's no real escaping this, and it's really hard to know how to take it all in. And for me, this was overwhelming and depressing and paralyzing. I struggled with these feelings for quite some time, and at a certain point I thought, well, maybe I'm just in a rut. Maybe what I need is some inspiration and adventure. So I actually ended up quitting my job, and I went traveling in Southeast Asia for 6 months. But even during my adventure, nothing really changed. I was a tourist, which is inherently kind of passive, and I didn't really have purpose to my travel apart from consuming other people's cultures. And for the most part, that felt kind of gross. And when I came back to Canada, the disparity between this country and someplace like Laos or Cambodia was so stark that it became really obvious that I was using more than my fair share of the Earth's resources. I was consuming way too much. And the way that I consumed was habitual and passive, like I was asleep. So even though the problems seemed just as big, my feeling of paralysis finally lifted, and I had an idea. So what I decided to do was to buy nothing new for 1 year. There's so much stuff being produced every second of every day that I felt like I could get away with not needing new things to be produced just for me, at least for a while. So I set some guidelines for myself. I wanted to participate in the secondhand economy as much as possible so that I could reuse and repurpose things. I also wanted to build a body of knowledge around my project so that I could learn how to repair or even make some of the things that I would have otherwise had to buy new. And I made a lot of decisions about things that I would and wouldn't buy. For example, some things I decided were going to be okay were things like learning opportunities or live culture, like music and theater. Most importantly, I really wanted to reflect on the ways that the project became difficult or even impossible, because I figured it would, and I wanted to really try to come up with creative solutions. So I started this project of buying nothing new, and I blogged about it. And looking back, a lot of the day-to-day minutia that I dealt with that year seems a little silly. Things like whether I could accept buying used socks or used underwear. The sock thing I got my head around pretty quick, and actually to this day it's really hard for me to spend more than about 69 cents on a pair of socks from the Sally Ann. Underwear was a little trickier, and I basically just avoided buying any underwear at all for the whole year. But what became more interesting to me than what I was or wasn't buying was really how and why I consumed what I did. Because I realized that my overconsumption was about a lot more than acquiring stuff. It was really wrapped up in my identity, in the way that I interacted with the world around me, connected with people I care about, and coped with depression, boredom, life's disappointments. It was all of these things, and when I started to really pay attention to how and why I consumed, I noticed that there was a new space and energy opening up in my life. And at first, this created a void that was actually really disconcerting and disorienting. I knew that I wanted to change my consumption, but I hadn't really got to the place of thinking about what I would replace that with. So for a while, I just sort of floated around in confusion. And thankfully, that didn't last very long. It was almost like this new energy was expanding to the point where it finally just exploded and splattered all over everything around me. And at that point, I started to do things. Kind of compulsively, actually, but it wasn't just doing things. I was making and building and creatively producing. For example, I just moved into a house with a backyard for the first time, so that spring I planted my first vegetable garden. I also started playing music again after several years, and I ended up auditioning for and winning a seat in the cello section of the local symphony. Around the same time, I started volunteering with my local community association, and out of the blue, I even took a film course and made my first short film. In all of these cases, it was as if the energy that had previously been tied up in consumption was suddenly freed up and available and in use with creative production. So this creative production wasn't the only thing that my new activities shared in common. Creativity had always felt like a really solitary pursuit, but I wasn't so sure suddenly. I was making music with dozens of other people. I couldn't make even the shortest of short films without a crew. I was meeting neighbors through my volunteer work who I would have never otherwise met. And even my garden, which initially seemed a place of quiet and solitude, was full of life. I was surrounded by community. And not only was I not alone, but I realized that I was relying on those around me to be able to be doing the things I was doing. These were collaborations that wouldn't have been possible if I'd been by myself. And the more that I paid attention to this, I found that the collaborations were taking me really by surprise, particularly in the garden, where I found myself in a relationship with the earth unlike any I'd known before. And I mean, I've always been in a relationship with the earth. I've always lived on this planet, and I've always used its resources. But that felt distinctly passive compared to the active, more connected relationship I found myself in my garden. And when I started to pay attention and listen to these collaborations, I really started feeling more connected to everything that was going on around me. And a good metaphor for this, and actually something that I was experiencing literally at the time, is a symphony orchestra. Because in the symphony, I was playing with dozens of other individual musicians. But I was listening so hard and working so hard at connecting with them that the separation between us started to really dissolve. And a cello section of 8 or 10 people can, with practice, start to sound like one instrument. And these separations seem to be dissolving all around me. And when I say that out loud, it sounds kind of romantic and new agey. And it is, and that's okay. But what I don't want to pretend is that this was an easy process for me, because I felt like I actually lacked some basic skills for it. When I thought about that, it made sense, because from childhood on, my education had been much more about competition for power and to have my voice heard than it was about listening and collaborating. And our society really defines most success by this competition for power. And when I think about how society treats the planet, women, indigenous peoples, it's really clear how practiced we are as an entire species at really exerting this kind of control and domination over each other. And I've really fallen in line with this really well all my life. I am much more comfortable when I feel in control of my life and relationships. And that's why it was so surprising and so transformative to find myself in a relationship with the earth that felt at once so out of control and at the same time so empowering. Because in my garden, I feel amazing and powerful. But at the same time, I'm really at the mercy of the planet. I can't control things like frost or gophers. Of course, I can try, but that's what most industrial agriculture does, and that seems to be missing the point. Because I was coming to understand that real relationships aren't about control and domination, but rather about listening to each other and working together. And what I found was that I was really starting to develop my own capacity for empathy. And this felt huge, because we need more empathy in the world, and our society doesn't really nurture it in us. And I began to understand that empathy isn't just about understanding the feelings of another. It really requires taking responsibility and being accountable for the well-being of other people. And not just other people, but other living creatures, and even the planet. So I really wanted to follow this further. And since all of these insights had been coming up around my own experiments in consumption and production, I wanted to follow those as well. And that's what I've done for the last few years to this day. For the last couple of years, I've lived and worked on organic farms. I've raised much of my own food, including animals who I've known by name and in some cases killed. I've lived in an off-the-grid home where I cut down my own trees to heat my home and cook my food, and I generated electricity through the sun and the wind. And I even make my livelihood now helping people grow their food and live more sustainably. So it might be clear now how much my life has changed, but you might be wondering how this applies to you or your life. So here it is. From this simple decision to change the way I consumed, my entire life was transformed. And a few short years later, I'm more creative and more connected, more collaborative, and have more empathy. And I can really only imagine what might happen if we undertook a similar process on a collective scale. I'd like to think that we might find ourselves in a world with less violence and more justice. So on that note, I want to leave you with a challenge, and it's twofold. The first part is to choose a way to practice being more conscious in your consumption. And that can be small and it can be really simple. It could be not watching TV while you eat, or maybe giving up television entirely for a while. It could be keeping track of how you spend your money and really where that goes. Or maybe you just stop buying new things for a while. Or you could go to the farmer's market and start getting to know the people that grow some of your food. Or you could even go to a farm and participate in the slaughter of an animal that you then eat. It really could be anything. The second part is, whatever it is, do it with as much attention and awareness as possible, and listen as hard as you can to what is going on in yourself and in the world around you while you do it. And be as open as possible to whatever it is you discover. And I'll be really, really interested to hear what happens. Thank you.